everybody, I'm Chris Yaw. Welcome to ChurchNext, and this is a place where passionate Christians come to learn from experienced mentors. And today we're joined by an innovative voice in the church who thinks that churches have a lot to learn when it comes to getting the word out. He's Richard Reising, and he's founder of something called the Artistry Labs, which does consulting, design, marketing, technology advising. Also the author of Church Marketing 101. And Richard, let's start right there. Welcome to ChurchNext. Glad to have you here. And how do churches do in your long experience when it comes to marketing?
Well, actually, probably not too well, but it's something I think that we're really growing in. I think the real challenge when it comes to marketing is coming from the corporate marketing world, really having a heart for the church, really feeling like God had really put a calling on my heart to leave my corporate position and serve the church. One of the big challenges that we saw was that churches saw marketing as a sliver of what really marketing is. They would see marketing as door hangers. Oh, you guys do door hangers. And the reality is marketing is really everything you do that forms the perception of who you are and those that you're trying to reach.
So there's a difference between marketing and advertising, I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you draw that distinction?
Well, the way that we draw it is this. Marketing, and part of this came out of a definition that we felt was kind of a God-given definition that we use for what marketing is. And marketing is this. Marketing is the management of perception. Okay, it's the management of perception. Now, it's not the manipulation of perception. It's not trying to pretend you're something that you're not. It's trying to make sure that you manage effectively how people see you. So if there are great things that are going on in the inside of your church, but the outside world doesn't know about it, well, guess what? You're not doing a good job of managing perception. So, and we see that Jesus managed perception. How many times in Scripture? I think over 20 times Jesus said something like, Jesus perceived their thoughts and said. So in other words, Jesus was someone who managed perception. You know, Peter and John on the day of Pentecost, the world thought crazy things were happening, but he gets up and he says, well, let me explain that we're not drunk as you perceive or as you suppose, right? So this quest to manage perception is a quest that all of us are on as Christians, to help people see Christianity in its true light, to see God's love in its true light. So that can be done on our websites, that can be done in our foyers, that can be done in our parking lots, that can be done in whether or not we mow the lawn. It certainly manages perception. Everything we do, every touch point we have with our community really forms a perception of who we are. And it's so much more than just whether or not we send out a flyer or put up a billboard. It's really everything we do as a church that causes people to understand who we are and what we value.
And there is an aversion. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No, that's great.
I'm imagining there is an aversion that you get in the church world, because when you think marketing, you think the guy with the loud jacket at the used car salesman lot, and he's trying to convince you to buy something that you don't really need. And so I can understand why pastors are a bit, wary of things like that. But I guess your point would be we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's got to be a certain balance there. Yeah,
absolutely. And at the heart of this, really healthy church growth comes from great ability to connect with people right where they live. You know what? If we're not doing that, then forget anything else that we're doing. I mean, that's the critical thing. As a matter of fact, we say that the majority of the churches in America should not promote themselves. So if you can imagine, we're saying, don't even promote yourselves at all. And people say, well, why? You say, you know what? If your current congregation, if they're not actively inviting people, there are reasons why. And you know what? If you do a big mailer, you're just asking the outside world to come in and see what no one else wants to invite anyone to see. And the reality is they don't like it. They don't come back, and they tell all their friends to not check you out. Well, that's bad marketing. So a lot of the things that we address in the book are how to really connect effectively with the people that walk in through those doors, how to steward that opportunity. You know what? At the end of the day, we forget sometimes how hard it was for that non-church person to walk in our church doors. And you know what? There wasn't a one of them that wasn't coming hoping that they were going to find their church, or they're going to find answers about God that they were looking for in their heart. And you know what? Oftentimes we have just created, we just minister unto ourselves. And we have missed our opportunity to be able to create bridges and create connections and go reach the lost as Christ has called us to reach, not just within our church, but again, as a church as a whole.
Sure, sure. So I like that kind of comment that you know, but you're the one about not inviting people to your church. But I guess what you're getting at is because, as you know, I mean, the vast majority, 80% of America's churches are not growing, and there are reasons that that's happening. So then, your charge would be to most churches: get your act together, huh?
Well, a little bit. I mean, part of it is just remembering our call. You know, Jesus said it really clearly. He said, you know what? And he was talking to a group of very dedicated disciples. Now, they were Jewish. Most of them were Jewish followers of Pharisees, and they were very committed. They knew the law. And he was talking to them very distinctly. And he said, you know what? If I had 100 sheep, and who of you, if you didn't have 100 sheep, you wouldn't leave 99 of them to go find the one that was lost. And so he said, wouldn't you leave? And he said, and wouldn't you rejoice all the more of the one that you had found over the 99? Well, we love that scripture and we go, yeah, that's so great. Jesus loves the lost sheep, and I used to be that lost sheep and he loved me. And then you go, okay, well, now who are the 99? And at a certain point you have to realize, well, that's us. That's church folk. Jesus pretty much said it without saying it, but he's basically said, hey, I'd leave you. Now we know he'll never leave us nor forsake us, but he said, I'll leave you to go find the lost. That's how important they are. And that's how important they are to God in his kingdom. And so a lot of times what happens as a church is that we've just lost focus. We've been so consumed with just trying to make it day to day, trying to get down the road and keep everyone pleased, that we've been pleasing the flock, but we have not been having the same prioritization that Christ has had, and willingness to give up maybe what the flock wants for what the flock needs in the pursuit of those that are estranged from the kingdom of God.
Yeah. Well, we like to be comfortable, don't we?
Yeah, it's challenging. You know what? And I caught myself in my own church this past week. They changed up the way they did their bulletins, and I went, I liked it the old way. And then I realized, man, you know what? It's not about me. And I think that's really the challenge, the thing that we have to fight on. It's not about us. And if we can get our congregations buying into it's not about us, and we can see the bigger mission of the kingdom of God, and we can rally people towards it, then all of a sudden we have a huge initiative. You know, one of the things that struck me as you were just talking was this reality that if you've had a life-changing experience with Christ, you want everyone you know to have a life-changing experience with Christ. I mean, I think it's just a given. If God has really impacted your life, you want everyone you know to have the similar type of impact that Christ could have in their lives. Yeah. And the reality is that most of us are not ashamed of Christ. Mm-hmm. We're ashamed of our church. And there's little things that we're doing as a church, or there are things that are going on, and there's a lack of confidence that we have that if I were to bring a friend to church, that it would happen, that it would end up well. And a lot of times those 80% of the churches are growing by some churches that have learned to get it right, that have learned to create churches that pass the people test, that don't just minister to those people that have been there for 20 years, but they also know how to minister to people that have been there for 2 weeks, or those that are coming for their first time, and those that are coming there. And you know what? The reality is that we have as much of a responsibility to have a deep end of the pool as much we have a reality to have a shallow end of the pool. We have to be able to help people take the progression into their plunge into Christ and help them to minister unto them right where they are. And oftentimes we just close it off. We have a deep end, and we just expect everyone to jump in with us. And you know what? That might have worked 50 years ago when the culture was just predisposed to church. But we're past that now as a culture, and we have to be able to create a bridge for those people that don't understand Christ. And so if we're doing a good job of doing that in our churches, well, what happens is that I feel the people that go to those churches, they feel more comfortable to attend church, and they feel more comfortable bringing their friends. So a lot of times what's happening is that one church does a really good job of being able to minister to anyone, is often not just reaching those that are the one lost sheep, but it's making the 99 happier, because the 99 can go be a part of helping find the one, bring them back and bring them into church, and feel confident that the outcome is going to be positive.
Now, doesn't church marketing, Richard, presuppose this kind of worldly idea that bigger is better, and that we need to grow bigger when really the idea of a large church is fairly new when you look at the history of Christianity? Help me through that.
Well, I would say this. I kind of have two thoughts here, and they'll somewhat sound like they're contradicting, but I challenge you to maybe think beyond how they sound contradictory. One is I believe healthy things grow. In other words,
yeah, Rick Warren makes that point, doesn't he? That it's just you're just removing the impediments.
Yeah, so I think healthy things grow, and so I think we need to be thinking about growth. And I think that we need to be growing both width-wise, meaning the number of people, but then also depth-wise. So a big challenge that we have both in the book and everything that we do is how do we assimilate people towards deeper steps in their walk with Christ. But then here's the other side of me, and my other side of me is this. I love pastors. Anytime I look into the eyes of a minister who's given up their lives for the sake of the gospel, who looked potentially their spouse in the eye one day when they were young and said, honey, we might not ever live in the big house and have all the things, but I feel like God's calling me to do this, and they stepped out on a limb and they did it. I am so behind them, regardless of if they have 7 people in their flock or 7,000 people in their flock. And I think the challenge is when they go to those church conferences, they always run into the next pastor next to them, and they look at the next pastor, and the next pastor says, oh, I see you're from Buffalo, New York. Huh. And then the next question is always, how big's your congregation? And you know what? That's certainly not how God evaluates our success. Yeah. And I believe that every church has to be able to define its own measure of success that God has given it. And that in some churches, you know what? It's within their realm, it's within their community for them to grow and to have 40% growth for the next 10 years. But then there are some churches that are serving a community where the community itself is going to decrease by 40% in the next 10 years. And the reality is that I believe that God has a very specific sense of what He values in that congregation. And I think it's incumbent upon every church to get alone with God as leadership and go, what does it look like, Lord, for us to be successful in expanding your kingdom? And I feel like a scorecard that's common to all is not a very biblical scorecard.
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes you question the metrics. I mean,
certainly.
Is it really about how do you quantify an abundance of experience, mystical experiences with Christ, or ways that people have given their lives away. Many times that happens as a result of going to church, but the church never has an idea about it.
Right, absolutely. What Jesus said, some will water, and some will plant, or some will water, or some will lay the seed, and some reap the harvest. And so at the end of the day, we don't know the part we're playing, but it's probably incumbent upon us to know our flocks well, and to keep track of what's going on to the best of our ability. But I think at the end of the day, I think the scorecard that God keeps for us is certainly not the same scorecard that I think a lot of churches keep for one another.
Yeah. No, I agree. So anyway, so you get hired by churches or by judicators or something to come in and take a look at what they're doing. And give me an idea. You've consulted a lot of churches. You walk into a typical church. What are some of the commonalities of things where people are falling down, that you've run across with most commonly?
Right off the bat, kind of a handful of things that we see a lot. Introverted culture. One, just the church as a whole have really, you can tell that they spend a lot of time with one another. Yeah. And you know what? Sometimes it's great to think, well, it's a family church. And the reality sometimes is that a family church is only family to the family. Yeah. And sometimes when someone walks in from the outside, they're very much not family. And so we think we're all happy and we greet each other well, and we really reach out to others really well. And the reality is that we might often do a poor job of reaching out to those that aren't already in the family. So sometimes we see this introverted culture. It's very common. Another thing, that just simple things like poor signage. It's just super common. I can't tell you how many churches you could just tell they did all that they could to get inside this building and pay for the building and buy this new building, and they didn't consider the fact that, you know what, there are going to be people that don't know Christ, that don't know the church, that are coming in for the very first time. And there's not, I'll tell you, lack of signage says very clearly to the visitor, this place isn't for you. We built this church for people that already know their way around. And so, you know what, that's another cultural thing that we see a lot of. Another thing that we see is kind of this challenge in that as a body, we often minister, I'd say to the inner court. We minister to those people that already know biblical story, and so we'll say, well, we all know what happened, with Cain and Abel, and then we go on to move on into another story. And the reality is that, if I'm there for the very first time, you just made me feel even stupider than I felt walking in. And so what happens is we often have a lot of in-speak. We have a lot of things that we say that we know and we assume on others, but if we assume those on others, we often leave others out.
Yeah,
yeah.
So it's pretty interesting to look at some of the polls I'm sure you've read of when they question people about biblical literacy, and how little even the people who are in the pews regularly. You may allude to a story, and they don't know. I mean, they live busy lives. They don't make it to church every Sunday. I mean, but this is something, I guess, between preacher and or leader and person in the pew, whether or not they would even be new, huh?
Absolutely. The kind of the analogy that we use in the book that really, and I'll just highlight it here, that really I think shapes this thinking here is I tell a story in the book about a time I hate baseball. I think it's the most boring sport. People they either hit the ball, they don't hit it, or they kind of hit it. So there's just not enough variables for me. But a friend of mine asked me to go to a game, and I said, sure, I'll go to a game. He said, but he had been asking me for 3 years. I kept turning him down, but I finally decided I'd go because he bought me tickets. So I had to go. So I go, and I'm sitting in the nosebleeds. I'm sitting up in the upper deck, and I'm just eating my hot dog. I don't really know how it all works. But in the ninth inning, there's a crack of a bat. The home team hits a home run. I give a high five to my friend. I'm like, wow, you know what? I can't believe it. I'm having fun at a baseball game. I never thought I could. And he says, well, why don't you come back with me next week? I said, well, I will, but we're going to stay in the nosebleeds. I'm not going down to the lower deck like those crazy people that paid $85 for their seat, And so for week after week, I'm sitting in the upper deck, and I'm starting to kind of like it. But all of a sudden, I start to realize that those that are down in the lower deck, right, those that are really into the game, they seem to be having more fun than I do. So I asked my buddy, hey, why don't you join me in the lower deck? So he joins me in the lower deck, and we go and we move down there. We pay $85. I borrow a glove from my friend. I almost catch a foul ball, but I don't. But the energy's palpable. I mean, I'm loving the lower deck so much. I'm never going to be in the upper deck ever again. I'm going to stay down in the lower deck, and I'm starting to know the players, right? I'm starting to understand. It's 4 balls, 3 strikes. I'm starting to understand it all, and now I have a pendant hanging up in my office. Everyone says he's really into baseball, and I even buy season tickets, so I'm sitting in the same place every time. Finally, someone says, "Hey, why don't you join me in a softball game? We've got a softball thing at work, and you could get in." And I'm like, well, I'll try. I'm kind of out of shape. I should do it. So, I joined the softball thing, and all of a sudden, you know what? I realize what's going on here. I've gone from being an outsider to being an upper decker to being a lower decker to being on the playing field. Yeah. And you know what? I believe this really resembles a lot of our walk with Christ. You know what? There was a moment we were outside. We didn't want to have anything to do with God. Yeah. And then someone invited us to church, and we're in the upper deck. And you know what? We're just looking around. We don't understand anything. Oh, but the crack of a bat. Something happened. God impressed something on our heart. The minister said something at the right time. Yeah. And all of a sudden, I realized God's real. But I'm not like those crazy people that are, giving offerings and tithes and are singing along with all the songs. But I'll come back. And you know what? After a couple of times, I'm in the upper deck. I come back, and then finally, I decide I'm going to commit my life and all. I have a heavier level of commitment to the things of God, and I'm going to take that next step. And now I'm down in the lower deck of church, and in the lower deck of church, you know what? I'm giving of myself more. I'm learning more. I know all the players, and instead of that pendant hanging on my wall, I got a scripture, and everyone knows it. Instead of having a season tickets, I actually just have a same pew that I sit in every single week. And then finally one day, someone says, "Hey, why don't you join us in serving in the children's ministry?" And so here I've come full circle from an outsider to an upper decker to a lower decker to a playing field. And the reality is that no one comes from an outsider to a playing fielder overnight. It's a progress. It's a process. Mm-hmm. And I think our challenge is to help churches understand the mindset of people that are outside that don't think there's any hope in church. And then to help those that churches that aren't doing a good job of reaching the upper decker, because if you don't reach the upper decker, then we're not fulfilling the Great Commission. And if we're doing a great job of reaching the upper decker, but we're not converting them to lower deckers, then we're not doing a good job of discipleship. And if we're not getting the disciples on the field, then we're just creating a bunch of fat Christians who consume all day long, but they're not activating their faith. So it's really about taking people steps in the process, steps of spiritual growth in the process. So that's kind of the passion, the things that we really help churches adjust and change to make sure that we're ministering to people at every level and challenging them to take their next step with God.
Sure. A very interesting analogy, Richard. So you started walking us through common problems that you observe.
Sure. In
terms of an introverted culture, poor signage, ministering to the inner core. Is there a place where you routinely start people? In terms of addressing their current marketing plan, if there is one, is there a place where you start people off?
Well, we break it into 3 parts. Okay, connectivity. First part we call connectivity is kind of the inner circle. The next outer circle is brand, and then the next outer circle is promotion. Okay, that's kind of what you would think of in advertising. Well, connectivity, being that inner circle, that's going to deal with things like visitor retention and assimilation. 90% of the churches in America, over 90% of first-time visitors will not return to a church. Wow. And honestly, that's a major challenge. Now, will we get all of them to come back? Jesus said, "I'll either be your stumbling block or I'll be your stepping stone." So
90% won't come back. And is that because maybe they're coming with a friend, or they promise so and so? I guess there are a lot of different reasons.
Certainly, there's basically 2 main reasons people will come to church, and I might add a third. The first main reason people will come is because they got invited by a friend. And the second reason that they will come is because they just felt the impulse in their heart that they needed to be in church. And they were looking up, a given church specifically, either because it was doctrinal, in other words, denominational. I used to be Baptist when I was growing up, so I'm looking for a Baptist church. Or I used to be Methodist, and therefore I'm looking for a Methodist church. But we also have the ability to impact them with street value. In other words, I drive by this church and it just something looks like great things going on, so I had to check it out, right? And then the other thing that causes someone to just visit out of the blue would literally be relational. In other words, I know 4 or 5 people that go there, and no one's invited me, but they seem like great people, and I just want to check them out. So we got to be thinking about those things. Anytime a uninvited guest or someone that just drops in on their own they're dropping in for either that. It's either denominational, it's either street, curb appeal, or it's that they know some people and that they have respect for those people.
Well, and your second reason, because I got to think that one's increasing, is that they felt in their heart.
Oh, absolutely.
I think there's this void, or there's this, something happened to me this week, and I need to just kind of make sense of it. Yeah. I had somebody stop in recently who'd bought something, and the woman said she was a medium and told her a few things that were very real in her life. And so that just kind of, oh my God, how do I process this? And so I think church.
Yeah, crisis is certainly the turning point. But which church they go to often boils back to those 3. Yeah. So in other words, man, I feel this need. I just need to go to church. Yeah. Well, which church am I going to go to? And often it goes back to, how did they grow up denominationally? Yeah. Was there any curb appeal draw, or was there a relational draw? Okay. Those, either if you're coming in that way or if you're coming in as a friend. And I said there was kind of the third one, and that third one was really this, just that it was an impression that God put on their heart. But even though I think they synthesize that through what they see. The Bible says that man looks on I think this is 1 Samuel 16:9 says, man looks on the outside and God looks on the heart. Yeah. And I just love the fact that God looks on our heart. He doesn't look on our ruddy outside. Right. But the reality is that man does look on the outside. So as much as we want someone to come inside our church and say, oh my goodness, I felt that God led me here and I'm committing to this church for the rest of my life, and I'm going to back tithe for the last 10 years that I wasn't here, and it's just rarely going to happen. What's more likely going to happen is they're going to see things that either make them want to come further or make them want to stay away. And it's really incumbent upon us as a church to communicate well and create an environment that they want to be in order to preach the gospel. So all of these reasons that people would come to church are all really a part of this thing I called connectivity. And I said 90% of the people won't return. That's a national just kind of statistic. But so some people think, well, should we get 100% of the people to return? And we've seen that a really healthy church that's growing tends to get about 30% of the people that come to return. So almost 1 in 3. So I don't think you can really expect too much more than 1 in 3. But 1 in 3 is a really good number, but 1 in 10 is a really challenging number. And it tells you a lot of things. So if I had, for example, and I'm going to use a corporate example just to help us understand this, but if I had just opened up a pizza place and I canvassed the neighborhood and there's an apartment complex that had 1,000 units and I put door hangers on every one, 50% off pizza. And of those door hangers, so I had 1,000 door hangers, and in the next 3 weeks while that special was running, I had 500 people come in with door hangers. Well, that would be amazing, right? It would be great success. Well, what if after 6 months later, only 30 of those people that had come in over those 500 that had eaten pizza with us during those 3 weeks, what if within 6 months only 30 of them had ever come back? Would you say I've got an advertising problem? I think you'd say I have a pizza problem. And I think that's really the challenge. Sometimes we think the solution is in advertising when the reality is we need to be introspective and go, where are we missing? How are we not passing the people test? Because once we pass the people test, once we can understand, Paul said this, he says, to the Jew I'll become as a Jew. And what he was saying, and to the Gentile I'll become as a Gentile. To the weak I'll become weak. I'll become all things to all men that I might win some. What he was saying in that is he was willing to take the responsibility on himself to change who he was in order to reach who they were. In other words, how do I think like a Jewish person? How do I think like a person of this background? If I was a Gentile and without the law, how would I think? So therefore, how do I speak to someone that comes from that frame of reference? To the poor and the weak, how do I share the gospel to the poor and the weak? So he was very much adept at being able to minister to them right where they are, thinking about who they were. And so that's a big part of passing the people test. We're often just so accustomed to maintaining our flock. And when we're not reaching those people that are coming in, a lot of times we think, oh, well, that's their fault. And the reality is, Paul said, I actually took the responsibility on myself to adjust the gospel to the people that I was called to reach. Right. And I'd say there's a lot to learn in that. And so how we can adjust the gospel. Again, we're not watering down the gospel. I would not advocate that at all. I would advocate, though, ministering in such a way that people that don't maybe know Christ would understand what we're talking about. Sure. I was at a church that was giving an invitation for people to take steps towards faith. And I remember a minister that said, you know what? He said, if you would like to receive the archetypical sacrifice of the lamb for the very first time, please come to the front. And I remember thinking, who in the world is going to know what that means? Yeah. Who hasn't already made that decision? Yeah. And so sometimes we are our own worst enemy, because the more educated we get in the things of God, we often forget what it's like to not know God at all.
So and I think, go ahead.
And so anyway, I just think that's one of our big challenges. And these are all part of that center section, that connectivity section that we're working with and helping churches do. Help them pass the people test. Not just get more people to come back, but get more people to take steps of faith. Because you know what? If you get 100 new people to come in 6 months down the road, you haven't gotten them discipled and you haven't gotten them volunteering, then you're not ready for another 100 because you don't have the volunteer teams that you need. So it's not just getting the numbers in the door, it's making sure that we have the infrastructure to support growth. And so the things that we do in that all lead up to what we call passing the people test. When you are a church that has strong connectivity, you're a church that passes the people test, now it makes sense to go to branding. Branding is, how do we design ourselves? What image do we convey? What is our style? And you might say, oh, well, we don't get into style. You're already into style. If you wear khakis every Sunday, that's your style. If you have a white picket fence around your church and it's a white steeple, you have a style. Regardless, if you meet in a converted strip center, you have a style, but you know what? You have an ability to shape that style as well, regardless of where you meet, to help people know there are great things that are going on inside your church. But most churches think, well, we need a new brand when they haven't passed the people test, when they are not getting great connectivity. They think their problem often is brand. The reality is their problem is not brand. There's if 8 people out of 100 return to their church after a first-time visit, there's nothing their website could have done about it. Okay, so website's a part of brand. Interior design is a part of brand. Signage and architecture are part of brand. Colors on the wall are a part of brand. Creating the right atmosphere. You know, Jesus was adept at maybe knowing when to get out on the water, on the boat, to be able to minister in such a way that the waves helped create an amphitheater. He knew how to create an atmosphere, and so that people could hear him and he would be heard. And so many times we walk into churches and we see lighting that just actually contradicts the minister. And so it's actually harder to pay attention to him than it is not, because of the way we created the atmosphere. So all of these are a part of the brand, and we're all helping develop that together and with consistency. The only challenge with branding is about consistency. So if to the extent that you're unstrategic in branding, because branding is all about consistency, you will be consistently unstrategic in everything you do. So you got to get brand right. Churches that don't pass the people test rarely get brand right. Once you pass the people test, get brand right, then we can start working on promotion. But 80% of the churches that walk through this process with us will never do promotion, because they'll grow so fast they can't handle it. So in other words, we were working with a church that had been growing at about 10% a year, had reached about the 600 point, and we went out there in September, and it was and by December of that year, so we went out there in September, they had been growing 10%. In September, they had to add another service, and then in January they had to add another service. So they had literally doubled in less than in 6 months, and we ended up helping them launch a satellite campus. And so we launched a satellite campus, and we were about to do a mailer, and the pastor called me and said, "Please don't do the mailer. We have no place to put them." So in other words, promotion is the last thing you want to do, because if you're doing it right, you'll get people excited about what's going on inside your church without having to spend bucks on promotion. I've never gotten an advertisement from Apple saying, "Hey, you should tell all your friends about your iPhone." But nonetheless, when I first got my iPhone, everyone wanted to see it, and I love my iPhone, and I just became a natural advocate for it. And so, you know what? When we create church that's full gospel, and I'm going to say full gospel, I'm not saying as a type of church, but meaning that I'm not in any way saying that we're changing the gospel. I'm just saying that it's all the truth that we know, but yet at the same time we're sensitive to be able to understand people in our community and be able to minister to them right where they are, but love them too much to leave them there. If we can create that kind of special blend, then we create a special place to go to church. And the people that attend our church will know it, and they'll be excited, and they'll tell people about it. And that's generally what happens when you get connectivity right and branding right. Churches tend to grow. And so our big challenge, as you can imagine, is we're in essence marketing people who challenge people that marketing is the last thing you need to do.
And so it sounds to me, from what you've described then, Richard, that you actually, almost do a pastor's work, because most of your efforts have got to be spent on that first bit of connectivity. Absolutely. Where churches just really fall down. Absolutely. We really put a lot of effort into it. We spend weeks often in the community. We will study their people. We will study the people in the congregation. We'll study the people in the community. We will learn so much demographically and psychographically about who they are and who they reach and who they don't reach, and do analysis of their church, and come up, literally do tremendous amount of analysis of everything they do as a church, and literally come in from an outsider's perspective and help them maybe recalibrate everything they do. Not because we want it to be a certain way. Let's do this model or that model. We really feel like our job is to go in there and help that pastor and that leadership team understand who God's called them to be, and then help them become the best version of themselves. Not to change them to another church, not to try and make them follow someone else's path, but to help them be the best version of who they are. So, well, a lot of these dynamics, though, and you probably run into it over and over again, because there are just so many of them. It almost must feel like you can't make any changes, because just groups of people get into these kind of ruts. Absolutely. And so often we're called to kind of be the catalyst to change.
the church that desires to change, but they can't get out of the mold, so to speak, and maybe they've got an elder board or their deacon. Not everyone's on the same page. We're a great, I think probably one of our greatest giftings is to be able to come into a church and create unity around what we could be, in such a way that instead of creating a church split, it creates church harmony, and it actually gets us off of the status quo, gets us off that bump a little bit, so and enables us to move forward. And part of it is just we're an outsider, and so when we come in, having done this for hundreds of churches, we come in with the heart of a pastor. We come in with that mindset, but yet we come in with the experience of having seen what works and what doesn't work in church after church after church after church. And so where oftentimes people are coming in and going, well, we can help you with your website and your graphic design. We're coming in going, we can help you get it right on Sunday morning in such a way that causes them to want to come back and wants them to get involved in the next step within the church. And then once we do that, now we wrap the right kind of brand around it so that when people see that brand who are inside, they're proud of it. Those that see it that are outside, then it's a promise that leads them in that we're assured to deliver on because it really represents who we are. I'm sorry. I was just saying, it's not just some pretty design. I have a friend that was in Florida a couple weeks ago, or I guess a couple months ago, and he said he went and found he was looking for a website for a church they might go to, and he decided that he saw this really neat website, and as he's in his late 20s, he said he thought it really represented him well, and so he and his wife went, and they were the only ones in the church under 60. Mm. But you know what? They had thought, well, if we just had this really cool website, it'll solve the problem. Right. The reality is that all it did is it makes you spend more time on people that probably that are never going to fit. Mm. So anyway, you had a question for me.
Well, yeah, I was gonna, one of the first common problem that you mentioned was an introverted culture, and I'm wondering, how do you go about addressing that? It's a challenge. It's different with different churches. I will say this: sometimes it's been as simple as a sermon series. Sometimes it's been as difficult as losing 20% of your congregation who are there for reasons that are very selfish. Sometimes people just like to go to church because they like it the way they like it. And so when we change things, they go, well, I don't like this anymore. Right. And sometimes, but before we take those steps, before we move into that, we were counting the cost. We knew that. I remember we were with a pastor, probably an 800-member church. They had been about the same size for about 10 years. And he really had a heart for his community. It felt like they could do more to reach more. And as we came in, we kind of said, well, here's where we see the alternatives are. And he said, you know what, I really feel responsible to take, this step. And so he'd kind of said, I think we should go this direction. And everyone on the leadership team said, yeah, that's exactly. And I said, well, let me tell you that if you take this step, you're going to have a number of people that are just not going to like it. And are you willing to let them go in love? And he said, in the leadership team agreed. This is what we were going to do, and we worked really smart. Talk a little bit more specifically about that, since we're not naming names or anything. I'm just curious.
They had as far as their culture was concerned, they had specific things I would say were core to their denomination, and their style. And they said, you know what, and they weren't, let's say, necessarily doctrinal. Yeah. They were just historical. Okay. And so, in other words, and I'm not talking. This isn't about the use of instruments versus. It wasn't one of those.
No. And I'm not asking you. And I hope people understand you're not making sweeping generalizations.
No.
But you're talking about a specific instance in which you were called in as a consultant, right. And in this specific context was the way. And I'm just curious as to how the more of the details there.
Yeah. Well, without.
Don't compromise.
Without demonizing the church.
Of course.
Yeah, one of the things that we were seeing is we were just seeing some things that were very denominational but very confusing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And so people were seeing it, and it was just creating an atmosphere where people didn't understand. A lot of times visitors were, and we called it out. We said, you know what? we believe, based on the community research we've done, the people that are likely to come in here will not understand these things that you're doing. And they said, and the way you're doing it. It's not that they won't appreciate the gospel. Right. It's that they'll be confused by what they're seeing. And they said, well, we're not, that we agree. And it's the funny thing is, the very next week, the pastor's wife invited her hairdresser, and her hairdresser came and said, I was so confused by this, and told her wife in confidence, I could never go back because this just confused me so much. And so it was just a tremendous reinforcement that there are some things they're doing cultural that kind of, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14 chapter, he said, what if people walked in that were unbelievers, would they not think you were out of your mind? These were the kind of things that were taking place. And so we said as a church, look, if we want to reach our community, then we might have to be sensitive to what Paul said and not do some of the things that people attribute to that.
So anyway, this pastor who had the same attendance for 10 years, takes your advice, goes out on a limb. I'm guessing a bunch of people left.
Probably 20% of the congregation left. And I remember asking him, and I remember it 6 months later, and again, this was all, we knew it was going to happen, but this was a church whose leadership, their heart burnt for the one over the 99. And so they said, you know what? He said to me on the phone about 6 months later, he says, you know what? We've lost almost 20%, and many of them were strong givers. And I said, well, were they the people we thought we'd lose? He said, yeah, they were those. And he said they'd come into my office and they would say, we're leaving because we miss having this and we used to like this. And I said, well, 201, I said, had any of them ever invited anyone to church? He said, I don't think any one of them had ever invited anyone to church, and some of them had been here for 10 years. And he said, so anyway, about 3 months later, he called me back. He says, Richard, he says, you know how I said we lost 20%? He says, we're back up to where we were. I said, really? You're back up to where we were? He says, now I got a real problem, though. He goes, we're changing diapers left and right. And I said, what? And, spiritual diapers. He says, we have seen more people come to the knowledge of Christ and have committed their lives to Christ and take steps along their faith than we ever have in all of 10 years. In the last 6 months, we've seen more of that transpire. And literally within about another year's time, they were up to about 20% of where they started, but yet a third of their congregation were fresh, new in their faith and growing in Christ. And all of a sudden they'd created a healthy place. Now, just to say this is a very, very rare occasion. It's very rare that a church ever has to go, well, we've got to count those costs. A lot of times, most of the time, we're able to say, look, how can we hold the hand of yesterday and reach out to the hand of tomorrow and keep it all in line? And most of the time, you can get the church to understand, to think beyond themselves, to care about the lives of others well enough to be able to bridge that gap. But it's not necessarily easy, and then sometimes it takes beyond the credibility of that church or that leadership themselves. Sometimes we're just the fact that we might even come in to a church that we're serving to help them see what we saw and help them diagnose from an outsider expert's opinion. And all of a sudden they start to realize, well, this just isn't pastor talking. This is a real dynamic, and we can really own it as a church. And now I can help them go, now let's rally behind pastor and the leadership, and let's go to this place. And sometimes we're getting churches that you thought were dead and didn't want to go anywhere, standing up and rallying Christ to go, let's take the land. And that's the most exciting thing ever, and that's really I think the heart of Christ is turning the church back to our mission, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Right. No, it makes plenty of sense. And so let's see. So really, you're saying that before a church really engages in marketing, it's got to get its act together. It's got to really, and a good barometer of that is, are people inviting their friends? Absolutely. Yeah, and are there ways you've seen it effective that can actually help people invite their friends?
Well, I think the challenge is as a church, when we think to ourselves, we need to tell our people to invite their friends because they're not doing it. Yeah. That's probably the first moment we need to stop. Okay. In other words, it's often the moment that we think, oh, they need to be doing this. And the reality is that my fundamental belief, if they've had a life-changing experience with Christ, They want other people to experience that. So if they feel confident that it'll happen in their church, they'll invite them. So, if I go to church on Sunday, if I go to your church on Sunday and I go, man, that was a really good message. One of my friends at work who doesn't know Christ really needed to hear that message. But you know what? The next week, if I hear the same kind of message, maybe it's very different topic, but I still think, man, my friend at work needed to have heard that message. If I hear it 3 weeks in a row, I am going to lasso my friend and drag him to church. Yeah. But the reality is, most of the time when we walk out of church, we think, wow, you know what? My Christian friend who wasn't here on Sunday, they should have heard this. Or you just think, oh, that was a good message, but you don't see its application to anyone else besides someone just like you. And so if we as a church are being more sensitive to reach the outsider, the upper decker, the lower decker, and the playing field, and it's a big challenge. Yeah. It's a big challenge to be able to do that. But you'll be able to study the Gospels and maybe even look for yourselves. Was Jesus ministering to an upper decker? Was he ministering to a lower decker? What did he say to his disciples only? You know, when he said, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. He was talking to a group of lower deckers and disciples, trying to figure out who was going to really stick with him. Right. You know, and sometimes we do that when we're in the masses. Mm-hmm. Jesus did preach that message when he fed the 5,000. Right. He talked very different to the 5,000 than he did to his inner court. And so I think sometimes the challenge is just recognizing that oftentimes we have in-speak. We talk like we assume you were here last week. We talk like we assume you've been in the pew for 20 years. And that way of talking only causes, it causes us to kind of create this self-fulfilling prophecy in that you get who you preach to. And if you are preaching to those that are lost and those that are new and those that are growing, you will get all of them. But if you're just preaching to those that have been going for 20 years, you'll only get those that have been going for 20 years.
Yeah. Well, when we first started the interview, as we wind our time down, Richard, I'm wondering if there's something that you want to mention we haven't brought up, or if there's something you want to elaborate on that we've talked about, or if there's any inspiration you want to give us as some closing thoughts.
Sure. Well, a couple things that a lot of these principles. Again, I'm not I think I make 80 cents on a book, so this isn't about the book, but conceptually, if any of these principles strike you, it's a great resource to go to. Then the other thing is just this. I would say I had this aha moment. I was working my first, I think the first year in college, I worked full-time cleaning offices at night. And I was the best at it. And the reason I was the best at it was this. Everyone else would go into, let's say, the stalls, and they would wipe down the seat, and they'd wipe down the handle, and then they'd leave. But I'd wipe down the seat, and I'd wipe down the handle, then I'd sit down, and I'd start wiping down everything I saw. Because I figured, you know what, it's most important how it looks like from this perspective. Right. Yeah. And in the same way, I would just challenge you this. And I'm sorry it's a weird analogy, but it was kind of an aha moment in my life. Look at your church from the eyes of an outsider. Go inside your church for the very first time. If you were new to your church, would you know where to take your children? Would you know how children's services worked? Would you even know what door to enter? You know, would you know where the restrooms are? When you walked into the worship experience, what would it say to you? What should it say to you? What is the one thing that you want to make sure, if I'm a visitor and I don't know God, or I'm new to faith, and I walk inside your church, what's the one thing that you want to make sure that I catch before I get out? And let's do everything we can to create that experience. Let's do everything we can to create that experience. This is our heart and our passion. We just want to see churches grow. The fact that 80% of the churches in America might be shrinking or struggling at this point breaks my heart. It ought not be. Sometimes we look at the churches that are growing and we go, well, they're just watering it down, or they just are doing this not right, or they're doing that not right. I would challenge you, take a weekend off and go visit them. Go see what it is they are doing right, what it is people are being drawn to, and don't just adopt it because it's there, but chew on it and understand what they're doing in reaching those people. And boy, we would get a tremendously better perspective. I would say that most churches are either underexposed. In other words, they spend so much time inside their church they don't know what's going on in the outside world, or they're overexposed. They go to every single conference and they're so involved in everything, and they've been to every big church that they don't know who they are. And there's a combination of being able to understand what's out there and knowing who you are that's really powerful. And when you've got that, you can kind of walk with a certain set of confidence, knowing that you're moving forward, executing who you are as a church. I kind of like to say, we like to help a church straighten its back so it knows who it is, so it can charge the mountain together.
Wonderful analogy to leave us with. I love that idea. And so thank you so much, Richard Reising, author of Church Marketing 101, consultant, and really I appreciate your wisdom and your gifts to the church. Thanks for being my guest on Church Next.
Thank you. My pleasure.